This next video lecture that you'll need to proceed through the rest of our coverage on the immune system, so no worries. All right, so the circulatory system is more commonly called the cardiovascular system, but your textbook is also referring to it as circulatory because this is referring to blood circulation. Your blood circulates out of the heart to your tissues, then it circulates back to the heart where it gets pumped out to the lungs so that it can be reoxygenated, and then it goes back to the heart, and there's a continuous circuit that goes on. And so your blood always contains white blood cells. White blood cells are important cellular warriors of the immune system, and then you've also got various protein weapons that we'll talk about that are present in the blood as well. And as you guys learn about in your A&P classes, fluid moves out of the blood and into the tissues and vice versa. So you have this communication that's going on between your blood and your tissue compartments. Then the lymphatic system is highlighted here by all these green vessels that you see here on the diagram. Now that's not a circulation. The lymphatic system includes fluid that is draining off of your tissues, and it's a one-way flow back towards the bloodstream. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that as we move through this video lecture. And no doubt you've heard of lymph nodes before, and the lymphatic system is very important for draining fluid off of your tissues and then filtering that fluid and screening it for the presence of microorganism invaders that may be present. So it plays a really, really important role in your immune system. And there's some other features of the lymphatic system as well, like your tonsils, your spleen. GALT is gut-associated lymphoid tissue. We'll talk a little bit more about those things as we move through this lecture. Then over here, they're trying to tie together the lymphatic and cardiovascular systems for you. Your blood circulates throughout the body, but as you guys learn about in Biology 202, fluid moves out of the blood and into tissues, and then to avoid an excess of that fluid building up in your tissues, your lymphatic vessels function basically like little drainage ditches that carry some of that fluid back toward the cardiovascular system, back toward your blood vessels. And along the way, it gets filtered by lymph nodes and screened for microorganisms. So let's review a little bit about blood. When you guys take Biology 202, you learn that your blood consists of a liquid component called plasma. Plasma is the liquid portion of the blood, and so that's got lots of water in it, of course, and then your dissolved solutes, various molecules, both inorganic and organic, are present there. And then you've got your cellular components, or what we call the formed elements. Those exist in the blood as well, and they consist of your leukocytes, your white blood cells, your platelets, which are not truly cells. That's why all of these things together are referred to as formed elements rather than cells. Then you have your erythrocytes, or your red blood cells. So this diagram is showing you what happens if you collect blood from a patient and you prevent it from clotting and you put it in a centrifuge in the laboratory, a machine that spins around, and that causes the more dense objects in the blood to settle toward the bottom. And so if you took that tube out, what you would see is the liquid plasma up on top, the erythrocytes, or red blood cells, down here on the bottom, and then right here there's a little strip called the buffy coat, which contains your leukocytes, or white blood cells, and your platelets. So right in there, that's where your cellular warriors of the immune system are located, your leukocytes. And so they consist of a much, much smaller proportion of the blood when compared to the red blood cells that are responsible for transporting oxygen to your tissues. Also in your plasma, you have clotting factors. So you guys learned about blood clotting in Biology 202, and that's an important aspect of helping to prevent infections as well. All right, so where do all these blood cells come from? So you guys learn about hematopoiesis when you take Biology 202. That's a term for referring to blood cell formation that occurs in your red bone marrow in certain bony locations in the body. And you guys also learn about how in your bone marrow you have stem cells. So these are unspecialized blood cells. They're called hematopoietic stem cells. And then as those cells divide, they go through different phases and specialize into different types of blood cells. So they travel down different pathways depending on the needs of your body and develop into those various type of what we call formed elements in the body. So when you guys study blood cell formation in Biology 202, you guys learn that you have these completely unspecialized stem cells in the bone marrow. As those divide, some of them change and become stem cells for all of your blood cells except for the lymphocytes. Those are also called myeloid stem cells. So now they're partially specialized. So these cells can only become the things that you see over here on the left side of the diagram. Other cells that descend from your hematopoietic stem cells become what we call lymphoid stem cells. And your lymphoid stem cells continue to undergo changes and ultimately become your T cells and your B cells. So those are our lymphocytes, and we're going to study those in chapter 13 because these are your main cellular warriors of the third line of defense. And some of them become a cell type called natural killer cells that we will discuss a little bit more in chapter 13 as well. All right. And over here again on this left side of the chart, this is where we have more things going on. So again, you've got a partially specialized stem cell here that's also known as a myeloid stem cell. And as those keep dividing, depending on your needs, now most of them are going to head down this pathway. So most of them are going to become what we call erythroblasts, and then they go on to become red blood cells. So you study that in Biology 202. Remember, these make up the vast majority of formed elements in your blood. And then some of them become cells that are called megakaryoblast. Those become megakaryocytes. So they're just undergoing changes, and those ultimately break apart and become platelets. So those are very important for both blood clotting and also inflammation. And then you've got another pathway over here where you've got a cell type called a myeloblast, and those will continue to divide, and some of those become a cell type called a neutrophil, and that's a white blood cell type. Some of them, not very many, become a cell type called basophils, and some of them become a cell type called eosinophils. Those three cells together are what we term granulocytes, and we'll talk more about that as we get deeper into the chapter. Some of these also become a cell type called mast cells that live in your tissues. You may have learned about those in Biology 201 a little bit. They're involved in stimulating inflammation when you have an infection or injury. And then some of these head down this pathway that you see over here, and they ultimately become monocytes. And monocytes are monocytes in the blood, but when they squeeze through your blood capillaries and get into tissues, they can become macrophages. And those dendritic cells we've been talking about are also believed to descend down this pathway also. All right, so all of these guys over here are white blood cells. All of these. Everything you see really here in blue are types of leukocytes in that shaded area. And over here you've got your red blood cells and your platelets. But these are the cell types that we're going to be focusing in on as we move through chapter 12 and 13. So again, these leukocytes, those are your main cell warriors of the immune system. They travel through the blood after they get out of your bone marrow, where they're made, and then they're capable of getting out of the blood, exiting the blood, and then moving into tissues where they're needed to help fight infections. All right, so that's the cardiovascular system. How about the lymphatic system? Let's hit some highlights here. All right, so your lymphatic system, this is a system of vessels, lymph fluid, and then you've got lymph nodes, you've got tissues like tonsils and the galt that I was just showing you on another diagram. The spleen is also considered to play a role within the lymphatic system as well. So this extends throughout the body. And what does this lymphatic system do? All right, so when you guys take Biology 202, let's zoom in on this figure over here. This is supposed to be a generic tissue, and when you guys take Biology 202, you learn that little tiny blood vessels called capillaries extend into the various tissues of the body, and they bring in oxygenated blood, and then they give up that oxygen gas. They give up nutrients like glucose. So those things leave the blood and move into your tissues. Fluid moves out of the blood and into your tissues. That's where your tissue fluid comes from. It's delivered by the blood as well. And you guys learn about how that's driven by blood pressure. So the pressure within these blood vessels is higher at the point where the capillary is entering a tissue, and that tends to squeeze fluid out. And then at the end where the capillary is leaving a particular tissue and heading back toward the heart, the pressure is actually lower. So that allows some of the fluid to move back into the blood vessels. So from the tissue into the blood vessels. Now when you guys take Biology 202, you learn that more fluid moves out at this end and into the tissue than gets taken back up at this end. It's not an equal back and forth. So because of that, you got to have some way to drain off this excess fluid, because you got more that's coming out of the blood than's returning to the blood down here. That's where your lymphatic vessels come in. They're basically like drainage ditches for your tissues. So as you have a lot of what we call hydrostatic or fluid pressure building up in a tissue, it pushes open some flaps on these little tiny lymphatic capillaries, which are the tiniest lymphatic vessels. And that fluid moves in here, and then it starts moving back away from the tissue towards some larger lymphatic vessels, and ultimately makes its way to lymph nodes. And lymph nodes are, you can see those scattered around here on the diagram. There are several hundred of those that exist in the body, and you guys know you've got some lymph nodes in your neck called your cervical lymph nodes. You've got ones in your armpits called the axillary lymph nodes. You've got them down in your groin, behind your knees, on the inside of the elbow, and so forth. So they're scattered at various locations throughout the body. You've got them in your abdominopelvic cavity as well. And these lymphatic vessels, what they do is they carry this tissue fluid that's now called lymph. That fluid enters these lymph nodes, and these lymph nodes filter that fluid to try to remove impurities. And so if there are any, let's say you have an infection going on in this tissue, there's some bacteria in here. As that fluid drains off, some of those bacteria are going to drain off as well, and they're going to be carried to the lymph nodes where this filtering will take place. So here's what a lymph node looks like if you cut one in half and looked inside. And again, you got several hundred of these scattered throughout the body. So all this lymph that's coming from various tissues, those smaller lymphatic vessels, the lymphatic capillaries, it's kind of like the blood vessels. They merge together into larger ones, which merge together into larger ones. And eventually those travel to a lymph node. So this cutout lymph node we've got here, notice you've got 1, 2, 3, 4 afferent lymphatic vessels on the diagram. So that's incoming. The afferent vessels are bringing in lymph that is drained off of tissues. And then in here, you've got lots of white blood cells. You've got B cells and T cells in here. Those are going to be the main cell weapons of your third line of defense that we'll talk about in chapter 13. You've got macrophages. You've got dendritic cells in here that are going to help stimulate your B cells and your T cells. So these are great places to have all of these cellular weapons of your immune system stationed, because again, if you have microorganisms in a tissue, some of those are going to drain off and wind up over here in the lymph nodes. So it's great you got all these white blood cells concentrated in these things, so they're poised and ready to intercept those microorganisms. And then as we'll see when we get into chapter 13, when you have these B and T cells, that get stimulated inside a lymph node, they start to divide over and over again. They get activated, and that's what causes your lymph nodes to swell. When you have an infection, you're building up this white blood cell army that's going to help you attack the infection. So that fluid flows through the lymph node, and the filtered fluid comes out over here. You've got a couple of efferent lymphatic vessels. So afferent's incoming, efferent is outgoing with this filtered lymph fluid. The filtered lymph fluid eventually empties into your subclavian veins, and you'll learn more about that on in Biology 202. So the filtered lymph, filtered tissue fluid, gets returned to the blood. So it's helping to conserve the fluid. What are some other lymphatic organs? So the spleen, kind of funny, it filters the blood. So lymph nodes filter the lymph fluid. The spleen filters the blood, but you've also got a lot of these leukocytes that are present there. And so because of that, it is considered to be part of the lymphatic system. The thymus is a special organ where T cells mature, so we'll learn more about that when we get into chapter 13. And so it's also considered to be part of the lymphatic system since T cells mature there. Now, we've already said that all of your blood-formed elements develop in the bone marrow. But T cells, when they leave the bone marrow in an immature state, and they migrate into the thymus, and it's there that they grow up and become mature T cells. And you've got some other lymphatic tissues like your tonsils, if you still have those. Those are kind of like big giant lymph nodes that are located in your pharynx and up in your nasopharynx, if you still have those. They're concentrated areas where you have lots of leukocytes, white blood cells are poised and ready to intercept invading microorganisms. On that earlier diagram, I showed you GALT, which stands for gut-associated lymphatic tissues. These are patches of tissues that have a lot of leukocytes in them, and they're located along the inside lining of the intestinal tract. You may have, if you've studied that in a previous class, you may have learned it as Peyer's patches. That's another term for the gut-associated lymphoid tissues. So all these things, you have some of these little patches of lymphoid tissues along the inside lining of the respiratory tract as well. So you just want to think about these lymphatic tissues being stationed in places where you need white blood cells congregating because they're good places to intercept microorganisms that are invading the body. All right, so that was kind of a quick overview of how the cardiovascular and lymphatic systems contribute and cooperate with each other in helping with the immune system and assisting with the surveillance of your tissues for foreign invaders. And now that we've covered that, we're going to move into an overview of these various cell types that are important for your second line of defense. So if I back up on my diagram over here, we are going to be focusing in on these guys right in here. Your lymphocytes over here are chapter 13 material. They're your third line of defense, cellular warriors. These guys over here are playing big time roles with your second line of defense, and so that'll be the focus of your next video lecture.